Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth event in the recovery stream of the 2022 Healthy Working Lives seminar series. Now, this series is focusing on the Compare project, and there will be one more seminar left in the series, and that was being held on Wednesday, the 1st of June. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We acknowledge the sacred land on which we are based. Mine is the Bunurong people. To land, sea and community. We acknowledge the sacred land and we pay our respects to the thousands of years of wisdom and knowledge found with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are the Indigenous owners of the land. Wamunjika, welcome, kia ora. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Pritchard and I will be your MC today for this event, titled What Happens to Workers with Long Duration Compensation Claims. So in today's seminar, we'll be hearing from Dr. Daniel Griffiths and Luke Sheehan. Dr. Griffiths is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Healthy Working Lives Research Group. And his research focuses on improving the quality of life, well-being and health of workers. Daniel's research encompasses longitudinal cohort studies investigating health impacts of work loss during the COVID-19 pandemic and studies on the health of mobility of older Australians. His areas of research cover approaches to manage workers' mental health and evaluating the health consequences of the pandemic response, including lockdowns, returning to work, and COVID-19 testing and vaccination. And we also have Luke Sheehan, who is a research officer contributing to the Compare project at the team as well. He has a master's in biostats from Melbourne University and a science degree from the University of Western Australia, and an invaluable part of the team. His research focuses on the recipients of income support systems and on the physical, psychological, financial health and health service use of these populations. So please note that there is a Q&A at the end of these sessions, and you can submit your questions anytime during the seminar in the Ask a Question button below your live stream. So now it gives me great pleasure in handing over to you first, Luke Sheehan. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. Today, I'm going to be giving a quick overview of what a long-term claim looks like in Australia's workers' compensation system. So just to start off, quickly, just some declarations. So this project, the Compare project, has received funding from the Australian Research Council, Safe Work Australia and WorkSafe Victoria. And the data today has been provided by via Safe Work Australia from each of the workers' compensation regulators. But the views in this presentation are from the Compare team and not of the regulators. So to start off with a bit of a rationale as to why we would want to look at long-term claims. So obviously a central objective of workers' compensation systems is to reduce the duration of time away from work and after a work-related injury and disease. So also a long period off work is associated with longer-term poor health and quality of life outcomes for workers. And also long-term claims are very costly for insurers and employers. And also, the longer a worker has been off work, the more difficult it then becomes for them to return to work. So to reduce these negative impacts, it's important to identify characteristics of workers who are more likely to be experiencing these long-term claims. And also over the last decade, several workers' compensation schemes have moved towards what we would call short tail schemes that have limited the length of time workers can remain on the scheme. And there's also limited research on comparisons across different schemes in the pattern of long-term claims in Australian systems. So for this presentation, we've defined a long-term claim as a claim with an income benefits payment of 6 months or more. So there's no set definition of what is a long-term claim. You might hear that 3 months is a common milestone that's used, but once a work's been off for 6 months, that's clearly quite a long time to be off work. And we've split claims in this report into 3 groups. So we've got claims from 6 to 12 months, claims that go from 1 to 2 years, and then claims over 2 years. And this study is looking at claims that were accepted in Australia's workers' compensation systems between the 2004 and 2016 financial years. And that's when the claim was accepted, and we've then followed the income benefits up to June 2019. So our research questions for this study were, what are the proportion of time loss claims in Australia's workers' compensation schemes that are long-term? So if we look at all the claims, how many go past 6 months? And then how many weeks of compensation are actually being paid due to these claims? We also wanted to know what are some of the characteristics of jurisdictions and workers that are associated with having a long-term claim. And also how have some of the workers' compensation scheme reforms affected the proportion and the rate of long-term claims. So to do this, we've used a couple of data sources. The main one is the National Data Set for Compensation-Based Statistics. And this is an administrative data set provided by Safe Work Australia to us, and all the workers' compensation regulators provide claim information to Safe Work Australia, and that's compiled into a single data set. So that gives us the volume of claims nationally, and it has information such as how long workers are on income benefits, as well as demographic information. And we've also paired that with the covered workers data set, which is a data set that has an estimate of the number of actual workers that are covered by workers' compensation and how many hours those workers are working. And those estimates are also broken down into demographic characteristics. So that allows us to compare the claim volume to the actual amount of labour that's being done in the population. That's really useful if we want to compare, for example, over time, and we know that the labour market has changed. There are more workers working now than there were in 2004. So it allows us to do that by having some sort of background level. The outcomes we're looking at in this presentation are, so just in the NDS, we have the percentage of all time loss claims that were long-term. So that's to answer our first question, how many time loss claims become long-term, and the percentage of weeks of compensation paid that are from those long-term claims. And then we can also look at the working population. Excuse me. We can also look at the number of long-term claims per million hours worked, or equivalently, that's the number of long-term claims per approximately 30,000 weekly full-time employees. And then we can also look at the number of weeks of compensation paid per hours worked as well. So now to get into the data, this graph is the percentage of all claims in Australia from 2004 to 2016 that went past 6 months. And you can see it's a fairly empty graph. There's only 12% of claims in Australia in this time period went past 6 months. We've got 88% of people returning to work. So that looks like quite a positive outcome. But if we look at the number of weeks of compensation that were paid from these claims, we see a very different picture. So actually, these 12% of claims represent 76% of all the weeks of compensation paid. And particularly we can see in this green claims more than 24 months, that 4% of claims represents almost half of weeks of compensation paid across Australian jurisdictions. The other thing we can see from this graph is if we look at these 12% of claims that went past 6 months, you can start to see the effect of how people return to work more slowly once we're past this 6 months. So in the first 6 months of a claim, 88% of workers returned, but in the 6 to 12 months period, actually only 5 out of 12 of these workers have returned to work. And then the next year, only 3 out of 7. And so we're still left with 4 of these 12 at 2 years. So something we like to do in the Compare project is actually compare jurisdictions on some of these outcomes. And so we'll take this percentage of how many claims are long-term and look at it across each of Australia's main workers' compensation jurisdictions. And you can see there's quite a lot of variation. So it ranges from 8% down in Queensland up to 23% in Victoria. And although you might think this may partially reflect differences in return to work, it's also quite likely to be driven by differences in policy between schemes in terms of access to the scheme. In particular, I think for Victoria, they have a 2-week employer excess. And I know some jurisdictions have an employer excess as well, but we don't see those claims covered by employer excess in our data set. So we have a lot less of claims in the first 2 weeks, which I think explains why there's such a high percentage in the data set for Victoria. But there's also other factors such as how long a worker can stay on a scheme. So for example, in Queensland, there's a fairly strict 2-year cutoff in other schemes, people can stay on longer. And in some schemes, workers have a greater access to lump sum payouts, and in other schemes, they don't. So they will stay on the scheme and continue to receive income benefits for a longer time. So that's one way of looking at it. But we can also take a step back and look at our covered workers and look at the rate of claim per the actual population work. So we can see here that actually flattens out the variation between jurisdictions if we look at it at a population level. So we can see, if we imagine from Comcare, if we imagine that in this hour that we're here for the seminar, there might be 1 million people in Comcare. I don't know if there's that many workers in Comcare, 1 million people working in Comcare in this hour. On average, about one of those people will have an injury that results in a workers' compensation claim. But we can see that there's less variation, but it does range up to about 1.5 in Victoria. And again, we can see post 2 years, quite a variation between jurisdictions. So this is the number of claims per million hours worked. But if we look at how many weeks of compensation come from these claims, here we can really start to see a difference between short tail claims and long tail claims. So as I mentioned, Queensland has quite a cutoff at 2 years, whereas in the time period of this study, some of the other jurisdictions such as South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria had a lot longer tail. And also Comcare, if you remember, Comcare had the lowest number of claims on this slide, but you can see they also have quite a long tail of claims in terms of the number of hours compensated. So it's clear from these slides that the policies of these jurisdictions is causing quite a large difference when we look around the country. But there are obviously other factors that can affect the number of long-term claims and the weeks of compensation paid from those claims, one of which is age. There's very clearly here also a strong effect of age. As workers age, they're much more likely to have a long-term claim, peaking at about 45 to 54 and then plateauing a bit. But if we look at sex, we can see that there's actually not much of a difference between male and female workers. Sorry, just excuse me. So another thing we would want to look at is injury type. And this slide is showing that the predominant condition that has a long-term claim and the hours compensated from long-term claims is musculoskeletal, but there are also some from mental health conditions, traumatic injuries and fractures. But if we go back to our first metric, which was what percentage of claims become long-term. So if you remember the first slide, there was about 12% of claims become long-term. If we look at that by injury type, we quite clearly see that mental health conditions are a standout here, where almost 1 in 3 mental health claims go for longer than 6 months. And on top of that, more than 1 in 10 is going for longer than 2 years. So I think clearly that's a risk factor for having a long-term claim, is having a claim for a mental health condition. We can also look over time. So we're looking from 2004 to 2016 at the claim acceptance date, as I mentioned, and we can see that over time there has been a reduction in the number of weeks of compensation paid from long-term claims after accounting for changes in the labour force, as I mentioned. So this is per million hours worked. So we can see it's gone from about almost 160 in 2004 down to about 90 in 2016. And there's a bit of a drop off around 2013, which I'll explore a little bit more later. But you can see there's been a quarter reduction in claims 6 to 12 months, about a third of weeks paid reduction for 12 to 24 months, and weeks paid for claims over 24 months is effectively halved. And this isn't just for long-term claims. The number of weeks paid for claims under 6 months has also decreased about a third in this same time period. And so that's overall, but if we look at this by injury type, we can see fairly similar patterns here for musculoskeletal, fractures and other traumatic claims, where we see the biggest reduction in weeks compensated for claims over 2 years. But if we look at mental health conditions, we see something totally different, quite strikingly different. When you look at mental health conditions, claims that go for more than 2 years, there's actually an increase of 11%, while for other conditions, there's almost 50% less. So that's something of note for sure for jurisdictions to be aware of, I think. And just finally, we were going to look at some specific jurisdictions that have implemented legislative reform in this time period. And the first of these is New South Wales. So New South Wales Workers' Compensation Scheme underwent a major reform in June 2012. And that's clearly had an effect on the weeks of compensation paid per million hours worked. You can quite clearly see the time when this reform was implemented. Part of the reform was tightening eligibility criteria for the scheme itself, such as strengthening the relationship between work and an injury in order to claim workers' compensation. But there was also a restriction on the time workers could stay on the scheme. So previously, many workers could stay on until retirement age. Now for workers with partial capacity, it's up to 130 weeks, and the maximum is 5 years. So you can see this has been a very large reduction in volume for long-term claims of all lengths, particularly claims over 2 years that reduced 62%. And this was quite a broad system change. So it also reduced weeks of compensation paid in claims under 6 months by 44% as well. So the other jurisdiction that I wanted to look at today is South Australia. And South Australia's had actually a few reforms in this time period, but the major one came into effect on July 2015. And you can see that's had a huge effect on the number of weeks of compensation paid from long-term claims. If you recall from the earlier graph, South Australia was previously a long-tail scheme. It had one of the highest number of weeks of compensation paid. So they've now clearly changed that to a short-tail scheme. So there was a change in 2009 initially, a smaller change that allowed there was an introduction of a work capacity at 130 weeks and step downs at 13 weeks that had some effect on the 6 to 24 month claims. And then in 2015, there's now a cutoff at 2 years for most workers, except for workers with a whole person impairment of 30%. But you can see there was actually an effect before 2015. And another thing that South Australia has done in order to reduce the number of weeks lost to long-term claims is they've actually started actively seeking out lump sum payments for workers who have been in the system for a long time and offering them lump sum payments so they can accept that and move out of the scheme. So just that's the data part of the presentation done. So just to summarize, long-term claims, they're only 12% of all the time loss claims in Australia, but they account for 76% of weekly benefits paid. We don't have data in the data sets we used on health costs and general costs, but you can imagine that they're also accounting for a large proportion of those costs. There are particular workers who are more likely to have a long-term claim. That includes those aged over 45 and claiming for a mental health condition. Time lost to long-term claims has decreased a lot from 2004 up until the 2016 period. However, time lost to mental health claims over 2 years has actually increased. There are large differences in the jurisdictions, and a lot of those are associated with policies. I haven't had time in this presentation to go into a lot of detail on that, but there are differences between jurisdictions in terms of access to commutations and redemptions, so lump sum payments, the length of access to weekly income benefits, and actually accessing entering the workers' compensation scheme in the first place, and how severe the mix of claims that you see in the scheme is. So the scheme reforms in New South Wales and South Australia, as we saw, had a dramatic reduction on the rate of weeks compensated from long-term claims. And there are now many workers with long-tail claims exiting workers' compensation schemes earlier than they may have in the past. And while I focused on these two jurisdictions, this is a trend nationally, and there are workers across all jurisdictions who are exiting these schemes. And what we don't know from this data is what happens to those workers. In some cases, we assume they return to work, but after 2 years, is that still a valid assumption for these workers? I'd just like to acknowledge the study funders, ISCA, Safe Work Australia, and the Australian Research Council, and once again, thank our data providers. And we'll be back in a moment with Dr. Daniel Griffiths. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luke. And I'll be following on from Luke's presentation about some findings from the transition study that focuses on the New South Wales workers' compensation system. So after long claims for workers' compensation stops, as Luke mentioned, return to work outcomes may be less likely or lower rates. So what are some of the other things people may turn to if they're experiencing periods of work disability? Well, some of them are listed here. And the one I'm going to focus on in this part of the presentation are transitions from long claims within the workers' compensation systems at the state level onto transitions to Centrelink benefits. And we'll also look at individuals that do not transition to Centrelink, although we know a little bit less about those in this presentation. After long claims end, very little is known about how people support themselves after very long workers' compensation claims. The information we have internationally come from different social security systems in the US and Canada. But there's some big gaps in knowledge for Australian systems of social security and workers' compensation. And we know very little about person level information, and crucially, no real direct measurements from transitions from the workers' compensation system onto the social security system, Centrelink here in Australia. What some of the evidence does show is that people with workers' compensation claims for long periods of time are more likely to turn to some of the disability insurance benefits, and that reducing the generosity of workers' compensation systems leads to an increase in the uptake of those sorts of disability insurance benefits. Much of the knowledge, as I mentioned, are in different systems internationally, and many of them are relatively old and have undergone significant reform since. So Luke mentioned two state-based workers' compensation schemes that underwent significant reform. That was New South Wales and South Australia. In New South Wales, in 2012, there was actuarial estimates projected a $4.1 billion unfunded liability. And it was projected that that would need to increase employer premiums by 28%. So in response to this financial position, the Workers' Compensation Legislation Amendment Act came in. What did this mean? Well, the scheme underwent a major reform in New South Wales, primarily focused on reducing scheme expenditure and also restricting eligibility for compensation and changes in the access to benefits and services. What we'll look at in quite a bit of detail in this presentation is what was described under Section 39 of the Act. So what that did, that capped income support payments. Those are weekly wage replacement payments for people with accepted workers' compensation claims. They were capped at 260 weeks. So that was capped at a 5-year period after 2012. There were some exemptions to this, which were people with assessed whole person impairments greater than 20% and some specific occupations. So the consequence of that 5-year limit on workers' compensation in New South Wales post-2012 meant that 5 years after that came into place, from late December 2017, these weekly workers' compensation payments were going to stop for about an estimated group of around 4,000 people that had at least 5 years of workers' compensation. Many had up to 10 or 15 years or more by that time. Whilst the income support payments would end after that 5-year period, this cohort had access to healthcare funded by the workers' compensation system for another 2 to 5 years. So this led in, so in late 2017, realized it would be important to identify what happened to this group of people after their workers' compensation claims stopped. And that gave rise to a study we call the Transition Study, led by the Healthy Working Lives Research Group. And the research question was, what happens to these people after long workers' compensation claims end? And more specifically, what were the impacts of the people whose workers' compensation benefits ended under Section 39, that 5-year limit on weekly workers' compensation payments? This was a complex process and protocol, which has been published in the International Journal of Population Data Science. The link's there. And some of the study findings from the first of 4 reports are available in the link, and I'll talk through some of the major findings in the next few slides. So to identify what happened to people after they effectively exited the workers' compensation system in terms of their income, we chose to link information from CIRA, the State Insurance Regulatory Authority in New South Wales. They provided workers' compensation claims, which were securely linked to a range of other national databases about regarding the health and welfare of these individuals, including medical benefit schedule items, medicines, Centrelink payments, and also information about hospital admissions. In terms of income support and thinking about those outcomes, today we'll look at some of the linked information of people with very long workers' compensation claims and the Centrelink payments that are received after workers' compensation stops. You might imagine we have a range of other important information about the health and welfare of individuals, both pre, during, and post workers' compensation claim. So who were the people impacted by this 5-year limit under the 2012 reform in the New South Wales workers' compensation system? Well, here's an example of an individual who perhaps experienced a work-related injury, illness, or disease in the course of their employment. They have an accepted workers' compensation claim. They've entered the workers' compensation system pre-reform, prior to 2012, and are receiving benefits associated with what was available, eligible at that time. Reform came in 2012, and then there was this 5-year period, this extra 5 years for this person, where they were allocated a transitional payment, a flat rate for everybody affected by Section 39, which was higher than they would have been getting previously. And after 5 years, that payment would end. And these people would presumably experience some changes in health or welfare or income after that final workers' compensation payment. So the study design of the transition study is to look at that 12-month period post workers' compensation claim, defined as that final weekly payment, and the 12-month period before as a reference point. So for this cohort of several thousand people whose benefits ended due to that 5-year limit, you can see that event taking place in the center of this time figure series here. You can see that at any given fortnight, a Centrelink payment was received, an income support payment was received from Centrelink by a large proportion of individuals after their final workers' compensation claim. And you see the wave of increase of the uptake of things like the New Start allowance in red, very quick transition from the final workers' compensation payment date in the middle, an increase in the disability support pension over time, and some people receiving the DSP, the disability support pension, prior to their final workers' compensation payment. We know that the monetary value of those payments are relatively small before and relatively large afterwards. You can see people transitioning to the age pension over time, and also the carer payment. And there are a range of other income payments, not things like the family tax benefit or supplements, but payments that are intended to support the income of the individual by design are relatively small in proportion compared to the New Start allowance, the DSP, and the age pension particularly. So in this figure, we look at 2,761 people whose benefits ended due to that 5-year limit. And we can see a huge uptake in Centrelink benefits within the 12-month period after workers' compensation stops. To put that into some context, we defined 2 control groups. So the Section 39 group I've just described and shown some of the results for. Those are people with at least 5 years of workers' compensation claims that ended due to that 5-year limit. We defined an injured control group. This group has at least have workers' compensation claims totaling at least 2 years minimum. And these claims have ended for reasons other than the Section 39 legislative change. We also have a community control group, which are age and demographically matched on other aspects, sex and residential location, to the Section 39 group as a comparison. And the community control group, as far as we're aware, do not have a workers' compensation claim. Who was included in this study? Well, we required a 1-year follow-up period post-claim to look at Centrelink outcomes. We also required people to satisfy the criteria of benefits ending under Section 39 and reaching 5 years or 2 years of workers' compensation payments. And with those eligibility rules, we ended up with just under 3,000 people in the Section 39 group, around 4,000 people in an injured control group with at least 2 years of workers' compensation claims, and 10,000 people with a community control group. It would have been challenging to find out information about these people after effectively exiting the workers' compensation system without using this data linkage approach. And the data of coverage, the coverage of the cohort of people with claims reached 97% with the data from the Department of Social Services. So what that meant was, for people within the Section 39 group and the injured control group, all those workers' compensation claims we were able to identify for 97% of that group, whether they went on to transition to Centrelink benefits or not. 3%, we couldn't answer that question. Here are some of the main findings, reiterating some of the points previously. So the black bars show the 12-month period after workers' compensation stopped. And we found that 60% of the Section 39 group that were subject to that 5-year limit went on to receive income support payments from Centrelink within 12 months after their final weekly workers' compensation payment. We can also see that 42% of people with at least 2 years workers' compensation claims that ended for other reasons than Section 39 also were receiving income support payments from Centrelink within 12 months after their final workers' compensation payment. From 1 year to the next, you can see a huge increase in the Section 39 group. A few small proportion were receiving Centrelink in the year before. You see a big increase from 1 year to the next, and the community control is relatively level. We can see a small 3% increase, largely attributed to aging from 2017 to 2018. There's no pre and post claim for that group as they don't have a workers' compensation claim. So of the 60% in the injured control group that received Centrelink, 40% were specifically receiving the New Start allowance, the main unemployment payment. And 16% of people with at least 2 years workers' compensation claims that ended for other reasons than Section 39 also went on to receive at least one payment of the New Start allowance within 12 months after their workers' compensation claim. So again, we see a huge transition from before workers' compensation payment stopped until the year after for those two groups. A very large transition onto the New Start allowance. Slightly less common was the disability support pension. We could see that 19% of the Section 39 group transitioned or were receiving that payment within 1 year after the workers' compensation payment stopped. similar patterns there for the other group. We know a little bit about the individuals that transitioned to Centrelink and those that did not. And the main finding here is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, those that transitioned to Centrelink were more likely to be aligned with some of the income and asset testing rules. So you can see that people transitioning were more likely to be unpartnered and non-homeowners. And we know that those are two features that come into the Centrelink eligibility rules. Importantly, whilst all of these people were eligible for many years of workers' compensation, relatively small proportions of people were transitioning specifically to the DSP. I just wanted to highlight that these are two completely different systems of income support with different sets of rules for determining eligibility between the workers' compensation system and Centrelink. So in describing specifically in New South Wales, this 2012 reform, including that 5-year limit on workers' compensation, some of the consequences of that were the movement and transition of people from the workers' compensation system onto Centrelink after very long periods of workers' compensation claims and work disability. It really highlights the importance of considering between system transitions of people with long periods of work disability, specifically to consider the potential health, economic and social impacts of such transitions. And given how common this was specifically for the Section 39 group, but also more generally for people with very long claims, it's important to recognize some of the opportunities or the importance of targeted supports to ease such transitions to Centrelink or to other forms of income support, more specifically when return to work outcomes are less likely, or return to sustained work are less likely. I'd just like to acknowledge the team that put this study together and some of the findings and results, and to CIRA for funding. The next step will involve a question and answer session, so please stick around and send in your questions for us. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome back to the Q&A part of today's event. So we're going to start with a question, Daniel, for you. And just before we do, just a reminder to pop your questions in on the button that says submit a question. Pop your questions in there, and we're going to be asking Daniel and Luke live right here, right now. So Daniel, we've got one question here. Why are there more workers from the Section 39 group moving into Centrelink than in the injury control group, do you think?
The two groups have quite different experiences. So the injured control group are defined as having long workers' compensation claims that end due to reasons other than that 5-year limit. So one of the reasons could be potentially returning to work. So we'd expect that to be, well, that's one of the optimal outcomes of the workers' compensation system. And due to the nature of the income assessments as part of the Centrelink application, to expect work income to be the main contributor to their financial position. We also know that the injured control group, their claims could also end potentially due to aging out of the workers' compensation system. So we know that that system focuses largely on people of working age, so their claims could end due to sort of graduating to that age limit, and some will be eligible for the age pension, some will not. And the Section 39 group are receiving their final payment due to a legislative change. That means there's no reason that would I'm not quite sure how to explain that, but there's no I guess there's no change in health that means their claim would end for any other reason. So their circumstances are effectively not changing other than the withdrawal of payment, which may have harmful or negative health effects.
Exactly, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, and that's what sort of struck me from both of your presentations. It's like, what next for this person? Yeah, just because they've changed the legislation and the figures look better and the variations are coming down, what next for that person? And it's great to see that we're beginning to investigate what is happening next for the person. So, Luke, I've got a question for you. There is great diversity and large variations that we saw in your presentation for long-term claims throughout the different schemes and jurisdictions. Is there an ideal scheme design, do you think, that we need to think about for long-term claims?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Elizabeth. And I think it's one I thought about a lot when I was putting this presentation together, because it sometimes looks from the graphs that, you know, one scheme is doing better than another scheme because they have less work, you know, long-term claims. But the truth is that we don't really know which scheme is getting better outcomes for workers, whether they stay on the scheme or leave the scheme, what's actually optimal for their health. So I think it's a bit of a researcher answer, but we need to know more before we can really answer that question. So yeah, I think that there needs to be, I guess, more follow-up studies of what happens to workers after they leave the workers' compensation system. Are they going back to work? Are they staying at work? You know, what's their health like longer term? You know, there are some resources for that. There's the National Return to Work Survey, which follows up claimants, but it's a fairly small survey, and it's a generally broader. So a lot of those workers have shorter claims. There are some workers with long claims in there, but I think specifically workers with long-term claims need to be followed up because we know they have much worse long-term return to work outcomes.
And also the psychological impact and mental health impacts, like you highlighted in different parts of your presentations as well. Be interesting to see and find out what happens there and how we could potentially address things in the future. Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming through from Alicia. Will there be any studies reviewing the return to the workforce following the movement of Section 39 to Centrelink?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Will there be any study into?
Sure. Would there be any studies reviewing the return to the workforce following this, the S39 or Centrelink movement?
Yeah, return to work for that group specifically. I think the approach we took was based on some of the data sets we had available to link together. I think we currently don't have plans to look at return to work outcomes via that data linkage approach, but one way to do that may be to look at linking tax records if that's available. I'm not too sure about information about that data set, but I think that would be the best way to look at that in line with some of the other work we've done. But just
there's another part to that question as well, because it might sort of lead on to that as well, Daniel. It's like, did the move invigorate the want to return to work? I don't know if you've actually addressed that or
yeah. I understand.
Yeah.
Just to sort of set the scene, this is a group of people with minimum 5 years work disability, many 10 or 15 or longer years. They're getting older as a consequence, and average age would be in the late 50s. So just question what potential do these people have realistically of returning to work with age-based barriers, potentially health-based barriers, and lack of experience, and really living on a reduced effective income compared to if they were working for a really extended period of time. Would it incentivize return to work? I'm not sure I can comment too much on that. Obviously, for most people, that's the best place to be, and I'm sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I can comment too much on that.
No, that's fine. Any other comments on that one, Luke?
No, I think Daniel's covered. I think that the main issue is once you've been off work for that period of time, getting back to work, as we know, it just is so challenging. And I think especially, I think for employers, you know, it would be difficult to sell hiring that person over another person who may have been working and, you know, has been well, and particularly we know there's barriers to people as they age getting new jobs and that sort of thing. So I think it would be very challenging if they did have the want to return to work. I think a lot of workers with these claims do want to be back at work, but there are a lot of barriers.
And one of those barriers as well is sort of linking to the mental health injury claims as well. So there's a couple of questions I'm going to, just in lieu of time, I'm going to pull them together if I can. So mental health injury claims, they're more likely to move to unemployment benefit or disability support pension. Are there any ideas around how around why they have longer periods of time? That's come up in your research. There's information around mental health and the extent of impact that can have on somebody's life. However, from your research, is there anything that you can talk about from the comparison between the mental health injuries and the physical health injuries and the length of time?
Excuse me. Yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of this study, there's not a lot of, we've kind of looked at what's happening. We don't have a lot of why in what I've done here, but I think the thing to consider is, I guess these are all work-related mental health conditions. So one barrier certainly is returning to a workplace that may have triggered or exacerbated a mental health condition. That can be very confronting. And another thing we know about mental health claims in workers' compensation system is they can take a little bit longer to process and maybe get approved. And that's something that's associated with long-term claims. So I think having that need to prove that you're mentally unwell or that there's a relationship with work, that can set someone back a little bit. And for a lot of physical conditions, that doesn't happen. It's obvious if you've broken your arm or something like that. So there are some specific risks, I think, for people with mental health conditions that may not be applicable for physical conditions.
Wonderful, thank you. And just for people who are wanting some more specific details or papers to read or reports to read, can you just point them, Daniel, in relation to where they can find these articles and reports?
I think there'll be a recording of this video, so you could review some of the slides. If not, the Healthy Working Lives Research Group webpage, they're probably the best places to start. Yeah.
Wonderful. And just very quickly, like 20 seconds each, because we're coming to the end of our time together today, what do you think is the one main thing that we can do next to help support workers who are in long-term workers' comp?
I think something that would be, sorry, Daniel, would be really great is, I think, so I've done a fairly broad overview of some risk factors for long-term claims, but I think in each jurisdiction, there'll be specific risk factors. There'll be general ones. So I think having an awareness of which workers are at risk of having long-term claims and screening workers for those who may be at risk, and then having, putting focus and early intervention to those workers is ultimately going to have the biggest payoff. Wonderful.
Thanks, Luke. And Daniel, final thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with Luke. Early intervention is up there as the top thing to do. And when that's not feasible or possible, just prepare people for life after their workers' compensation benefits end. So transitional supports.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I'm just going to wrap this all up today. Thank you so much for your time and your presentations, Dr. Daniel Griffiths and Luke Sheehan. If you want any more information, you can find it on our website, Healthy Working Lives Research Group. Thank you for attending this 5th Compare project event for 2022 in the Healthy Working Lives seminar series. And the final event in the recovery stream will be Wednesday, the 1st of June, 12:30 to 1:15 p.m. AEST. So make sure you sign up there and come and join us on that last one. The seminar is titled, How Do Workplaces Support Return to Work? And the guest speakers are Dr. Shannon Gray, who you see was one of the authors on this work as well, from the Healthy Working Lives Research Group, and Andrew McGarity from Fire and Rescue New South Wales. So make sure you register up for free on the platform. Hope to see you there. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you again, Daniel and Luke, and have a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye.